always been a man of simple beliefs, hard work, faith, and the knowledge that the world was as it appeared. No more, no less. But I tell you now, on my dying breath, that there are things beyond a man's understanding, things that do not need belief to exist. And it all began with a curse. It started in the autumn of 1928, a season where the Pennsylvania woods burned red and gold. But in our town of Stewartstown, a darkness settled in long before the winter. The whispers had begun months prior. Cows drying up, children falling ill, marriages breaking apart as though something unseen had woven itself into the fabric of our lives. Some folks pointed fingers at each other, but the name that carried on every tongue was Nelson Rehmeyer. Nelson was a powwow doctor, one of the last of the old ways. He knew the charms and the spells, the ways to cure warts and heal sickness with nothing but a whisper and a stroke of the hand. But as easily as powwow could heal, it could also hex. That's what they said anyhow. I didn't want to believe it. Nelson had been a neighbor, a friend even, but my own farm was suffering, my cattle thinning, and I, John Blymeyer, felt a weight upon me heavier than any burden I had known. There were nights I couldn't sleep, nights where the walls seemed to breathe and a shadow crept through the corners of my vision. I was being watched. I knew it. I felt it. Desperate, I sought the guidance of another powwow practitioner, an old woman whose name was barely spoken above a whisper. She examined me, her fingers tracing symbols in the air around my body. Then, with a voice like brittle paper, she said, "You are hexed." The words sent a cold dagger through my spine. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Nelson Rehmeyer." I could barely speak. I had known Nelson all my life. How could he have done this? Had I wronged him? Had I unknowingly angered the man? The old woman told me there was only one way to break the curse. Steal his copy of The Long-Lost Friend and burn it, or cut a lock of his hair and bury it deep in the ground. That night, I returned home with a purpose I had never known before. I would confront Nelson. I would demand an answer, and if he refused to lift the hex, I would do as the old woman instructed. But I did not go alone. I turned to my friends, John Curry and Wilbert Hess, men who had also suffered misfortune. They too believed that Nelson had cursed them, and they would stand beside me. We set out for Rehmeyer's Hollow, under a sky black as ink, the wind carrying with it the scent of earth and dying leaves. The deeper we walked into the woods, the quieter the world became. Even the crickets had ceased their song. Something unnatural lingered in the air. I told myself it was just my nerves, but I knew better. And as we reached the house, the old, sagging place that stood like a sentinel among the trees, I saw something in the upstairs window. A flicker of movement. A shadow that should not have been there. The house was watching us, and it knew why we had come. The porch creaked beneath our feet as we approached the house. I hesitated, my knuckles hovering over the door. Wilbert and Curry stood behind me, eyes flicking nervously between the trees and the darkened windows above. The wind carried whispers, though whether they were real or merely the tricks of a fraying mind, I could not tell. I knocked once, then twice. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. The door swung open, revealing Nelson Rehmeyer, his towering frame filling the doorway. His eyes, sharp and knowing, studied each of us in turn. "John," he said simply, his voice thick as molasses. I swallowed hard. "Nelson, we need to talk." He stepped aside, motioning us in without a word. The air inside was heavy with the scent of burning herbs, and something else. Something metallic, like blood. Candles flickered on every surface, casting elongated shadows that danced across the wooden walls. Strange symbols had been carved into the beams above. Some I recognized from powwow charms, others unfamiliar. He led us to the sitting room where an old tome lay open on the table. The long-lost friend, the very book we had come to take. Curry shifted uneasily. Nelson, folks in town, they say you've been casting curses, that you've hexed us. Nelson exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You know better than that, John. Powwow is for healing. And yet my crops rot, I shot back. My tai chi whiter, my kitty grai ketchrai, course whiter, white. Whiters a grind couch. And I wake at night with shadows pressing on my chest. If it's not you, then who? He studied me for a long moment, then slowly reached for his pipe, lighting it with a single match. The flame flickered unnaturally before settling. There are darker things in these woods than powwow magic, he finally said. You feel cursed because something is watching you, John. Something old. The room grew colder, and a shudder ran through me. I wanted to believe he was lying, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. Still, we had come here with a purpose. I tightened my grip on the blade hidden in my coat. I would have my answer, one way or another. The weight of Nelson's words settled over the room like a thick fog. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. He spoke of things watching, things older than powwow magic, but I had not come for riddles. I had come for an answer. Wilbert and Curry shifted uneasily behind me, their faces pale in the dim candlelight. The book sat between us, the long-lost friend, the source of Nelson's power. Or, so we believed. If we could take it, if we could burn it, the curse would break. That's what the old woman had told me. But now, looking at Nelson's unmoving expression, I felt the first tendrils of doubt creep into my mind. I licked my lips, forcing my voice to remain steady. If it's not you hexing us, then what is it? Nelson took a long drag from his pipe, the ember glowing in the dim light. His eyes flickered with something. Pity, perhaps? You think burning my book will make the shadows leave you be? I straightened. That's what I was told. A slow, grim smile spread across Nelson's face, one that did nothing to reassure me. Then you've been lied to. Curry lost his patience first. Enough games, old man, he snapped, stepping forward. His hand shot out, grabbing the book. Nelson's eyes darkened, and before I could stop him, Curry ripped the book from the table. The room shifted, not in the way a house creaks when the wind blows or when the floorboards groan beneath weight. No, this was deeper. The very air seemed to twist, as though we had all been tipped into another world, one where the laws of reality bent and stretched like melted wax. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching upwards unnaturally, licking the air like hungry tongues. Nelson rose to his feet, his presence towering, though he hadn't moved an inch closer. His eyes gleamed, dark and knowing. You shouldn't have done that. The moment shattered. Curry screamed. The book in his hands burned, not with fire, but with something else. Something black, something writhing, something alive. He dropped it, stumbling back, clutching his arms where the darkness had touched him. Blisters formed instantly, his skin bubbling, peeling. John! Wilbert shouted, panic flooding his voice. Do something! I acted before I could think. The knife flashed in my hand. Nelson didn't flinch. I drove the blade forward, aiming for a lock of his hair, just as the old woman had told me. But before I could reach him, before the steel could even touch his flesh, Nelson spoke. Not words. A name. The room collapsed. A howling wind roared through the cabin, slamming into us like a tidal wave. The candles snuffed out all at once, plunging us into an unnatural darkness so deep I felt as though I had been buried alive. My body seized, my limbs locking in place. A voice, low, guttural, inhuman, whispered in my ear. You don't understand. Then, all at once, silence. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw Nelson standing exactly where he had been before. But his eyes, they were wrong. They weren't human anymore. Something in that moment shattered my last shred of doubt. Nelson Rehmeyer wasn't just a powwow man. He wasn't just a healer. He was something else. And we had just made a terrible mistake. The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever known. It pressed down on us, thick and suffocating, swallowing even the sounds of our own ragged breathing. Wilbert's eyes were wide with terror. Curry clutched his blistered arm, and I could not look away from Nelson. His eyes were wrong. Wrong in a way that defied nature. They weren't merely dark. They were voids, pits of endless night, ancient and knowing. He stepped forward, and the very air seemed to tremble. The walls groaned as if they were alive. The floor beneath us pulsed as though something beneath it stirred. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. Then Nelson smiled. You shouldn't have come here. His voice was not his own anymore. It carried layers. Deep, guttural tones beneath his words. Whispers that slithered through my mind like serpents. Curry let out a strangled cry, backing away. We didn't mean... Nelson's head tilted. The room darkened further. You took what wasn't yours. My gaze flickered to the book on the floor. It no longer burned, but the air around it shimmered like heat rising from a summer road. Something waited inside it. Something vast and hungry. Wilbert grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my sleeve. John, we need to leave. Nelson took another step forward, and I saw his feet weren't touching the ground anymore. A new fear took hold of me, one deeper than anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't fear of death. It was fear of knowing. Something was here with us. Something old, something powerful, something that had been waiting in these woods long before Nelson Rehmeyer had ever drawn breath. And we had woken it up. The ground beneath us lurched. Curry let out a shriek as the floorboards buckled beneath him. His feet sank, not through wood, but into something black, something writhing. It coiled around his ankles, pulling him down as though the house itself had grown a hunger of its own. "Help me!" Curry screamed, thrashing wildly. Wilbert lunged for him, but Nelson only laughed. It was not a human laugh. It was a chorus of voices layered atop one another, a sound that did not belong in this world. The walls shuddered, the shadows lengthening unnaturally, slithering toward us like living things. Curry's face twisted in agony as the darkness consumed him, his skin peeling away like wet paper, revealing something writhing beneath. He tried to speak, but his mouth stretched too wide, far wider than any human should be able to. Then, with one final scream, he was gone. Wilbert stumbled backward, horror twisting his features. "We have to get out now!" Nelson's gaze snapped to him. His eyes burned red. "No," he whispered. "You are already mine."